Speech in 3, 2, 1. Neither side of this debate can fully avoid harm from manifesting. A failing industry is still a failing industry. So the question is, which side better mitigates those harms? On proposition, we tell you that bailouts are simply inefficient, which leads to more harm for people on the ground. And funnily enough, opposition barely says anything to counter this. Instead, they attempt to attack our points. I'll show you why our points still stand despite that, and why their harms are all but guaranteed to manifest and are unmitigated on their end. One call out before I do so though, note that we have built 2 to 3 new mechanisms and arguments at WIP and an entirely new response from Reply. Their LO never explained why private corporations can't act as safety mechanisms in the same way that states do, and to increase investor confidence. And also, they don't talk about why debt exacerbation is necessarily likely to manifest due to private investment during their constructive speeches. So don't credit those. But even if you do, note that they still fail to engage with our preemptions. Note that the path of victory coming from opposition is simply to prove that bailouts are able to achieve 2 main things. First, that you're able to fulfill critical roles within society and ensure that those corporations survive, and that B, you're able to protect people on the ground by ensuring that they stay employed. Does this actually happen? No. We clearly state from both Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, as exemplified by the 2008 financial crisis. Oftentimes, even the $700 billion bailouts that come from the United States towards these banks was barely enough to cover up of the foreign debt that these banks owed to different countries to ensure that the United States still had the trust of foreign investors. Note that these corporations and these banks that were bailed out were no longer able to fulfill their critical roles in society, which is what led to the recession post-2008 financial crisis. I say this very explicitly within my deputy speech. Second, are they able to keep employing the people that they used to employ before? At best, you still have mass layoffs, and those people that could have benefited from those government funding that we spent on bailing out those banks and having them transition to other corporations instead, and funding corporations that can actually take in, are wasted. And at best, you have a skeleton corporation that has much less employees than you have before. I say this again at deputy. But even if you don't buy that, we already explained to you why that's actually much less likely to happen. And in fact, it's just very likely that these corporations aren't even able to hire any employees at all. At most, all these bailouts are able to do is maintain these corporations as legal entities, but not restore them back to functioning states. But again, even if you don't necessarily buy this, we already explained to you that in the cases where corporations can be saved by the amount of money that opposition wants to invest, we explained to you why it's much more likely that alternatives are able to work. Because if you have enough capital to make the system work again, and it isn't or your structure is fast or okay enough that an injection of cash is enough to fix things, then likely alternatives like, for example, debt leniency or credit windows being increased are enough to give you that cash inflow. So they aren't able to explain why our alternatives don't work when their structure does. But then they aren't able then to prove to you that these corporations are able to fulfill critical roles, nor are they able to explain to you in opposition why those claims that they have of being able to feed people, prevent them from going hungry on the street, are able to manifest because they magically assume that bailouts are able to do this. But they simply don't. But then they try to argue that, okay, that how do we ensure that investor confidence is maintained, and how do we ensure that private principles are maintained? Note that these pushes are actually largely irrelevant if they can't prove or aren't able to prove that they are able to protect unemployed workers on the grounds. But I already explained to you, like first, on the private principle push and how debt exacerbation occurs if you allow private corporations to take over and bail out other corporations. Note that it doesn't make sense. Like the 2008 financial crisis, taking on those risky financial maneuvers from banks was not because they didn't have government bailout. It was simply because they took on additional risk to earn additional money. And the risk was taken on by the government. So of course they will take on that additional risk if they stand to earn more money, knowing that they will be bailed out in case the government decides to bail them out. The analysis just doesn't make sense coming from them. So I have a hard time buying that. But then, in terms of investors, we already explained to you that MNCs only invest if they're sure they can succeed. So bailouts actually don't matter. And investor confidence will remain unshaken if they're sure that they can succeed. And also, they have the money to ensure that if it does fail, they'll be completely fine. With that, I just explained to you why none of the benefits manifest on opposition and all their harms still maintain, and they fail to take down our points. We tell you that the most efficient form of investing your money is spending it directly on people instead of failing corporations that will mismanage the money and not be able to employ people properly. Instead of paying off their debts, pay the people and feed them instead. Very clear proposition win. Thank you.